It's my pleasure to be here talking to you about the issue of political violence and terrorism in the Middle East. And what I want to do is try to provide, I think, a bit of a framework, because I think that we tend to lump in a lot of different phenomena and issues together in ways that aren't really productive in terms of understanding the challenges that we as a nation face, or understanding the challenges themselves as they exist in and of themselves. And let me sort of lay out sort of four different dynamics or challenges and suggest how they're different and how they may be similar in some cases. First, throughout much of the Middle East, we have the rise of a variety of Islamist movements. We call them radical Islamist movements, you call them just plain old Islamist movements. There are a variety of parties in a number of different countries, either legal or unlawful, who are trying to agitate to get into power. Some of these folks do indeed have a desire to create a new caliphate that stretches from West Africa all the way to Indonesia. But I'd like to have a weekend in Vegas with Megan Fox, but that ain't going to happen either. And so we can't always judge them by their aspirations, right? You're talking about people who may have this fantasy world dream, but the truth of the matter is that most states in the Middle East, most Arab states in particular, have trouble holding themselves together, right? Much less conceiving of a whole cross-culture, cross-language empire that could someday be a threat to the United States. So what is the threat and challenge that comes from Islamist parties? Well, it comes on different levels. On one hand, we may not like the way in which those parties might govern if they came into power. Think of the Taliban, okay? Forget about the terrorism sponsorship just for a moment. I promise we'll come back to it. But just think about the way the Taliban itself governed, right? Or the way you have in a country like Saudi Arabia, where you have very harsh repression at various times, religious repression and so on. That's not the kind of regimes that we particularly like. That's not the kind of regimes that we would like to live under. But what is the U.S. national security concern with those regimes? It's harder to pin down. Okay? If you have a regime that comes into power in some country that happens to insist upon a pure definition of Islamic law, right, rule according to the Quran, and that imposes all sorts of hardships on its population, including horrible treatment of women, that's a problem. We may not like it, but is it something that you are willing to risk American lives to prevent or to end? That's a fundamental question. I'm not sure it's one that the answer is obviously yes. It may not be obviously no either, but it's not obviously yes. So when you hear about the spread of Islamic party or Islamist parties, even radical Islamist parties or fundamentalist Islamist parties, ask yourself, what exactly is the problem here? Okay? We can't get involved in everybody's internal politics. One step up from in the challenge is when you get insurgencies, which are spawned by these Islamist parties. And here the dynamic is usually something like this. For whatever reason, these parties are not able to come into power. Now, in some cases, it's a democracy deficit, right? There's no legal pathway by which these parties might be able to influence politics, and therefore they become frustrated and turn to violence. There's other cases where there is a legal or quasi-legal pathway, and they're just not very popular. In either one of those cases, they may choose to use violence, launch an insurgency. The insurgency is defined as a use of military force by a sub-state actor designed to overturn the existing government and replace that government with a government of its own party. Again, do we care? Well, there have been pretty significant Islamist insurgencies in a variety of parts of the world where it hasn't been a huge policy problem for the United States. Okay? Algeria went through a horrific Islamist insurgency in the 1990s. Egypt had a very rough Islamist insurgency. Yemen has one to this day going on, and there's some problems that arise out of it. There's an Islamist or quasi-Islamist insurgency in South Thailand. Not all of these are fundamentally problems for the United States, though. They have problems for countries on the ground, but they may not be problems for the United States. And here we have to be careful again. So not only are Islamist parties in and of themselves not always a problem, but Islamist parties, even those that use violence, may not always be a problem, right? They may be groups that are fighting for control of a government, but that's not a problem for us necessarily. Now, there are cases where there is a problem. Pakistan. An Islamist party taking over Pakistan and its possession of nuclear weapons, I would consider that a major problem. You might make the argument that an Islamist party taking over an oil-rich state and then using oil as a weapon would be a problem. But even then, walk it through. Okay? Think about the oil issue. What would be the cost of defeating that insurgency? because insurgencies are hard to defeat. They take many years and many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of men to defeat. Think about what you could do as an alternative. If instead of trying to prevent insurgencies in oil-rich countries from taking over, you conceive of a way to minimize your exposure to oil shocks, right? More alternative energy, larger strategic reserves, a number of things. Okay, so again, here's a type of political violence that occurs, but not necessarily when it's fundamentally problematic. Now, insurgencies tend to use two tactics. One is called guerrilla tactics, and the other one is terrorism. Guerrilla tactics are when insurgencies, or sub-state groups, use violence against government officials or government facilities or military facilities. Terrorism is when they use violence against civilians. We have a visceral reaction to terrorism. It's an unlawful kind of warfare. It's unlawful according to every tradition of warfare, right? Almost every tradition of warfare begins with the principle that you ought to be discriminant in your use of force. And that's true of both Western just war tradition and Islamic just war tradition. So when terrorists use force against civilians to try to achieve political outcomes, they are violating norms and principles, and that strikes us in a visceral sense. And we can make an argument, right, that we as the community of civilized nations have a shared desire to prevent terrorism, that it violates our norms in such a fundamental way that we must take action against it. Like in the way we talk about genocide, right? That genocide, once we define it, ought to be, although not always is, ought to be a fundamental call to action, right? It should put us on the hook to do something. You can argue that terrorism also puts us on the hook to do something. But again, I think that's a questionable point. I'm not convinced that any kind of attack on civilians anywhere in the world is necessarily an American security threat, even one launched by Islamist groups. Okay, come to the last category, anti-American terrorism by Islamist groups. Now here's where I think there's a consensus that we have to do something, right? The United States has interests abroad. The United States wants to maintain security of the homeland. And as a result, we have to be concerned about this anti-Islamist, anti-American Islamist terror. That's a major issue. I think we all agree on that. My warning, though, is not to try to say, just because we're concerned about that therefore we have to be concerned about all Islamist terror or all Islamist insurgencies or even all Islamist parties. There's room for a differentiation in American foreign policy. And here's why. I mentioned already that one of the reasons why you get some of this violence which occurs is because Islamist parties are thwarted in their attempts to gain political power by virtue of democracy deficits, right? We know Albert Hirschman wrote a book, Exit Voice Loyalty, which talks about this, that if you don't give people a voice in their governance, they tend to lose loyalty in the government and therefore turn to violence. What we don't talk enough about is the dynamic we see in much of the Muslim world, which is a transference of this violent impulse away from the local governments, which are in fact doing the aggrieving of the population, and on to the United States. And that is what differentiates al-Qaeda and some al-Qaeda affiliated groups from other kinds of challenges. Al-Qaeda is the group that first came out and said, look, the problem isn't just the oppressive regimes in the Middle East, it's that the United States is supporting them and keeping them in power. And therefore we have to attack the far enemy, right? Not the near enemy, which are the governments in power in our region, the far enemy of the United States. Al-Qaeda is not just a brand name, right? It's a strategic framework which says that the violence which is being spawned throughout the Muslim world for a whole variety of reasons, some cases democracy deficit, some cases ethnic insurgency, other things, can be externalized onto the United States. And that's the interesting part, right? And here's where we differentiate ourselves from our allies, right, in much of the Muslim world. They have an incentive to do the same thing that Al-Qaeda is doing. Al-Qaeda wants to strike the United States, and guess what? Saudi Arabia, if the choice is violence against Saudi Arabia or violence against the United States, what do they prefer? Well, what would you prefer, right? And so we have a situation where if by lumping all of our challenges together, we reinforce a dynamic which says that, yes, it is true and it is accurate that it's best to strike the United States. We have to find a way to short-circuit that. That's why we've seen such a bizarre paradox in counterterrorism policy over the past 7 years. The Bush counterterrorism policy has worked, but hasn't accomplished its goals, right? Its goals were, it was designed to eliminate state sponsors of terrorism, and it's largely done that, right? It was designed to demonstrate strength, right? Because the notion was that we weren't powerful enough, we hadn't shown people that we were tough, and that if you took us on, you'd be pushed back. And it was designed to limit financial resources or commit attrition against the jihadists. None of those are good strategic options. I'll tell you why. First, states didn't sponsor terrorism. They may have tried to take advantage of its existence, but fundamentally, it is a sub-state phenomenon that states themselves were trying to deal with. States like Saudi Arabia weren't sponsoring radical Islamist violent groups. They were having to deal with radical Islamist violent groups and felt that it was better, ultimately, to see those groups strike the United States than to strike the Saudis. Demonstrating strength didn't work because the reason why we're being targeted isn't because we're seen as weaklings, it's because we're seen as being strong and as being the country that's overwhelmingly powerful and imposing its will on the Muslim world. And we weren't going to succeed through financial constraints or attrition. Financial constraints, look, do you know how much it costs to launch a terrorist attack? Almost nothing. An IED in Iraq, $100. The London bombings, somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000. That's a drop in the bucket in the international financial system. Terrorists have been able to fund their operations through kidnapping, through drug trade, through credit card fraud, through petty theft. There's no way that you can squeeze the international financial system enough to prevent them from getting access to the minimal amounts of money they need. In terms of people, there are 50,000 jihadists worldwide. There are 3 times that many gang members in Los Angeles alone. Think about that. We can't eliminate gangs in Los Angeles, but somehow we're going to kill or deter enough people in the Muslim world off a population of 1 billion that they can't replace the few thousand a year that are killed or captured by our forces. It's not going to work. So in short, we tended to have real problems in our counterterrorism policy because we have overgeneralized the threat and assumed that everything which can possibly relate to radical Islam is itself a threat to us, and we've pursued the wrong strategies. And I'm going to stop here, just give you a quick 2-second outline about what our response could be. Our response could be to think about limiting our fingerprints and footprints on the Muslim world. That our goal shouldn't be to get more involved and to deepen our connections. Our goal might be at some point to think about how can we separate our future from the future of some of these unpopular regimes in the area. And if we can reduce our footprint in the region, get rid of some of our military bases, as well as just our policy footprint, and some of our fingerprints, so that people in the Muslim world don't think that everything that bad that happens to them happens because of us, that may be a more productive avenue to minimize the effect of violence that is inherent in the region for a whole variety of reasons and minimize the effect on us as a country. Thank you.
You know, I have the honor of briefing various departments and intelligence agencies in the government, but trust me, this is way more interesting, and it gives me more pleasure, and I really learn more from you guys when I come here to speak. I've learned that students are proving to be more sophisticated intellectually and more nuanced than our officials are. Anyway, it is a truism widely repeated that we must think differently to confront the challenge of terrorism in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Yet, despite spending billions of dollars in this passage of over 7 years, much remains to be done before we're ready to meet our own adversary. If the first rule of war is to know your enemy, we'll still have a long way to go. Now, what I would like to discuss with you today is the current status of Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, 5 years after the war in Iraq. Is the enemy stronger or weaker? Has it adjusted? Has the strategic threat changed? And finally, are we doing better in combating it? I'll try to answer these questions and, if time permits, offer them some thoughts on how the next American president can help Middle Eastern countries basically neutralize the threat of Al-Qaeda. I'll limit my remarks to a certain geographical focus, basically Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Algeria, and a few words about Yemen. Bernard has addressed it already. Pakistan, Afghanistan. Pakistan is, the epicenter of the most dangerous corner in the world. Terrorism, nuclear weapons, narcotics, dictators, failed state, they all come together. And, American, British, and European counterterrorism officials, they don't agree on too many things. And they don't cooperate as much as they should. But if there's one thing they all agree on, it's that the biggest headache we're facing as far as terrorism comes from the Pakistan-Afghanistan theater. There have been a number of official reports laid out by international intelligence agencies that talk about some sort of a resurgence of al-Qaeda in the Pakistan-Afghanistan theater. But there are also independent counterterrorism experts who would argue that, simply that al-Qaeda is not on the march, but in a process of transformation. And if I could just add one footnote here, if I were to write a paper, just put it in the bottom of the paper, which is, please see the almost pointless debate between Bruce Hoffman, a very good friend of mine, and Mark Sageman, which appeared in the Foreign Affairs, because I think their theses are not mutually exclusive, as they both like to believe. They're not mutually exclusive. But I do recommend you read that debate because it has policy implications. Anyway, it's difficult to measure if al-Qaeda Central is still alive and is still capable of planning and perpetrating terrorist attacks of the magnitude that we saw in 9/11. But I'm comfortable saying that it is very much alive, and it at least has the interest of planning spectacular attacks like 9/11. Now, it is no secret that Pakistan is the world's most active sponsor of terrorist groups, and in its support, it basically backs some groups, maintains contacts with others, and turns a blind eye to a number of other groups. I would also add that support for terrorism in Pakistan is a broad-based activity involving an array of government and non-state actors. Now, why does Pakistan support and tolerate terrorism on its soil? Three reasons: strategic ambition, domestic politics, and government incapacity. What is quite distressing, is the fact that al-Qaeda's relocation to Pakistan has also provided new opportunities for the organization to expand its reach in the West. Thanks to connections to the Pakistani diaspora, visitors from Pakistan have relatively easy access to the Pakistani community in the UK, and Pakistani-born Britons can readily travel to Pakistan and back. Al-Qaeda's growing connections in Europe have made other countries more vulnerable too. If it had not been foiled, if you remember, we all know that the plot in August 2007 to destroy 10 commercial airliners that were heading from the UK to the US would have been absolutely devastating. Iraq. If you look at al-Qaeda in 2003, this was pretty much an organization that was on the ropes. And the Iraq War, the decision to invade that country and occupy it fundamentally changed everything. It opened doors for the organization in the Middle East. It got emboldened, and the chaos that followed after the invasion basically benefited the organization, and it offered tangible evidence, as the leaders of the organization would argue, both that Washington had imperialist designs in the region and that the jihad against U.S. forces was actually working. Now, we all know this was untrue, but this is the narrative of the leaders themselves, and it is very relevant because it resonates in the global Islamic community. Now, I want to remind you of a painful quote by the number 2 al-Qaeda, Ayman Zawahiri. And he talked about how the United States was being caught between two fires when they went into Iraq, that either they'll stay there and be bogged down or withdraw and lose everything. I think it's an overstated, it is overstated to a degree, but there is a certain amount of truth in that, because the Iraq War really brought the organization back, and in particular helped it with inspiration. Yes, there have been many setbacks of the organization in Iraq. It no longer is an insurgency. It is turning into this annoying terrorism problem, as senior members of the Defense Intelligence Agency would like to believe. But it is there. It still has a haven, safe haven, and as long as Iraq is a failed state, and as long as serious political reconciliation is not taking place, Al-Qaeda in Iraq is still going to be there, and it's still going to spill over into neighboring countries in the region and cause massive chaos. And we've seen it already in Lebanon. We've seen it in the Palestinian territories. It is in its early stages, but you already hear it. In Gaza, affiliates of Al-Qaeda are basically either sympathizing with the ideology, following the ideology of Al-Qaeda, trying desperately, basically, to send their resumes to the Al-Qaeda leadership and tell them, listen, we believe in your cause, but why don't you help us out? Why don't you give us some money, give us weapons? We are there. We're in the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Israel is just there. Why don't you pay more attention to us? And I'm talking about those two affiliates in Gaza, basically, Jaish al-Ummah and the other organization. I forgot its name, but it's pretty similar. They all sound the same. Saudi Arabia, very few words about Saudi Arabia, because really it is a major, major front in the war on terror. And this was one of the biggest ambitions for bin Laden, basically, to wage war at home because their stakes were so high. 3 phases, basically, to find the war that the kingdom basically has fought against bin Laden and his supporters. The first phase was, if you remember, 1979 with the siege of Mecca, and that obviously did not work. The Saudis used the help of the French, chemical weapons, French military help, basically fooled the takeover. The second challenge was in the 1990s. We saw the bombing on the Sang training facility in Riyadh in 1995, and then the second attack was in 1996, in which 19 Americans and 1 Saudi was killed in an attack against the United States Air Force barracks at Khobar. And the third challenge, which is obviously the more daunting challenge, and which the kingdom has been facing since 2003, since the invasion of Iraq. And the Minister of Interior basically has said that there have been more than 180 terrorist operations in the kingdom since 2003. That tells you a lot about the fallout from Iraq. And this is the longest and most violent campaign of unrest the kingdom has faced since its modern founding in the 1930s. Now, the initial response was probably not the best. It was very uncoordinated and disjointed. But as time went by, they learned from their mistakes. The Saudi establishment has actually impressed a number of governments, even the U.S. government, in how they dealt with the threat that they were facing. They've gotten much better. They've gotten better intelligence on the cells. And so far, you could say that the battle that they've been waging against the terrorists, they've won it. But it is premature to say that the war in the kingdom is over, because it is very much in Osama bin Laden's, it is on his agenda, and it's a priority for him, I would guess. Now, Algeria, very few words about Algeria. The transformation of Algeria's nationalist insurgents into a force, basically, in the global Islamic insurgency is absolutely a page out of bin Laden's playbook. Expanding his reach by bringing local militants under the Al-Qaeda brand, as Bernard eloquently puts it. The Algerian group offers Al-Qaeda hundreds of experienced fighters and a potential connection to militants basically living in Europe. And over the past 20 months, suspects of North African origin have been arrested in Spain, France, Switzerland, Italy, although their connection to the Algerians it's never been always clear. Now, this offshoot of Al-Qaeda in Algeria is now running small training camps for militants from Morocco, Tunisia, and as far away as Nigeria. Keep in mind that the State Department in April categorized the tribal areas in Pakistan, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic Maghreb as the 2 top hotspots in its annual report on global terrorism. The threat is felt most acutely in Europe, and in particular in France. I mean, just ask the French counterterrorism officials and the domestic police, and they will tell you that they are now under a double threat, and they're very worried about that. The European intelligence officials are investigating basically this group's real aims, and I can tell you that there's a debate on that issue. There is disagreement inside Europe and disagreement between Europeans and Americans on that issue. For example, you know, the head of the counterterrorism division for the EU believed that their ambition is to attack in Europe, but that he wouldn't hard sell it. And he also wouldn't say that Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is supposed to attack in Europe. Now, the Americans are skeptical. You know, when Tom Fuentes, the FBI's head of international operations, when he opens an office in Algiers, that tells you that really they are worried about the threat of terrorism that comes out of Algeria. Yemen, very few words about Yemen. We all heard about the terrorist attack against the U.S. Embassy, and that should come as no surprise. The terrorist infrastructure in Yemen is solid, and it is homegrown. It is proving to be a major challenge for counterterrorism officials in that country and for international intelligence agencies. In retrospect, the Yemeni government appears to have essentially considered its counterterrorism task complete by the beginning of 2004. But the network currently attacking targets in the country, most recently the U.S. Embassy, does not appear to have coalesced around the paroled former militants, the Iraq returnees, or aspirant jihadists. Instead, the impetus for renewed attacks has come from militants who escaped from that maximum security prison, I forgot the name of that prison, in Sana'a in February 2006. These Al-Qaeda sympathizers in Yemen and affiliates are capable of suicide operations. But what is interesting is that they're also interested in maintaining operational security. This is not a death cult, full of young martyrdom-seeking people with no greater, ambition than a dramatic end. No, they are really careful about the targets. They are professional, and these characteristics basically give the network more longevity than most jihadist networks. I cannot quantify the terrorist movement in Yemen, and it's always been hard to do that. But it does appear that the organization remains capable of carrying out attacks, and this is evident again by the professional attack that we saw against the U.S. Embassy very recently. Now, a few words about how we can do better to combat this threat. If we misunderstand the threat, we tend to come up with failed policies, and it's pretty basic. For example, like invading and occupying a country in the heart of the Middle East and aggressively promoting democratization in the region. These are pretty, have proven to be at least counterproductive strategies. It's all about how you react. And if you don't exaggerate the threat of terrorism, if you engage in a rational and open-minded debate about it, something I'm almost convinced you just cannot do in Washington. Maybe here in Orlando, but you cannot do it in Washington. This war does not need to be a long war. You go back to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and this is a major issue on how to better deal with this terrorism problem, which the Bush administration has completely neglected or has done in a terrible manner for the past seven and a half years. This time in the Middle East, it's crucial to get it right, and it's crucial to do it fast because the stakes they've never been higher, and failure to have comprehensive peace between Arabs and Israelis is going to have consequences and repercussions of a magnitude we've never seen before. So you might ask, what has changed? What has fundamentally changed? Well, what's changed is that we have now a new evildoer in the Middle East, a new piece to the peace process puzzle, which is Al-Qaeda. And this piece simply cannot fit, and it should not fit. Of course, you have spoilers in the Middle East who just are not, for their own reasons, are not interested in the peace process, like Iran, like Syria. But they pose a different problem, and you can negotiate with them, you can engage with them. This is a different problem. Al Qaeda, you simply cannot sit on a table with their leaders or talk to them or anything like that. I've talked to a number of people who disagree with me that you actually can sit with them and reason with them. I guess I'm a little pessimistic in that regards. Why is the peace process related to the terrorism issue when the Bush administration has always claimed that it's actually not related? When you achieve peace between, we have two processes today, basically. One between the Syrians and the Israelis, and another between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and both have gone nowhere, as we all know. We're told that process is better than no process, and it's, even if it's going to take a long time, when there's a process, then we still have to be optimistic. It's going to take a while, but we'll get there. We can't wait anymore, because the forces that are already powerful, that are breeding radicalism in the region, are getting stronger and stronger. And this is music to bin Laden's ears, because this gives him more recruits and this gives him more foot soldiers for his organization. There are two separate parts of the terrorism problem. You've got the Al-Qaeda leadership, which is located in Afghanistan, Pakistan, which we call the Al-Qaeda Central, and then there's the foot soldiers. You have a problem here with not more than 200, 300 people, and then on the other hand, you've got the sympathizers and the potential terrorists of thousands of people. And these require different solution sets. One is dealing with Pakistan and trying to enlist its support, the Pakistani government, in dealing with the tribal areas. And then you've got the other problem, which is, in my opinion, more challenging, which is to convince these people who have lost hope in peace that not to join the global jihad. And this requires an absolutely massive effort to basically promote development and enhance the regional stability in the region. And again, offer hope, and because this will dry the swamp of terrorism in the region. And once you have that, bin Laden has no more foot soldiers. What he would still have is basically his close followers. And even in that regard, you see the debate, and it's not an irrelevant debate. There's a serious debate going on in the Islamic radical community, basically talking about whether it's smart to actually attack the United States, whether it's smart to attack civilians, whether it's smart to label the Shia as infidels. And you've seen that in public reports, in articles authored by a number of people, including Peter Bergen and others. So these are two separate issues that really we have to think about very hard, and they require really different solution sets. I'm going to finish with a quote. I never thought I would do this, but I would finish with a quote by former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. And I think his quote captures part, but only one part of the problem. Some of you in this room may remember the leaked memo of October 2003. And Rumsfeld says basically, are we capturing, killing, or deterring and dissuading more terrorists every day than the madrasas and radical clerics are recruiting, training, and deploying against us? That's a very smart question. If the answer is yes, I guess we're moving in the right direction. 7 years after 9/11, the West still finds it difficult to understand Al-Qaeda. Yes, bin Laden is an iconic figure, but Al-Qaeda has no king that could be overthrown. There's no checkmate move that could end it. And people often think in these terms, basically, in terms of victory, how to achieve victory, and mostly in linear structural terms. Our idea of victory, is derived from those terms, in chess categories. this is a mistaken approach. This is not about raising the flag as we did in Iwo Jima or anything like that. This is a long battle, and it's not about establishing some kind of victory, but actually dominating the battlefield. And thank you very much for listening.
If terrorists were to have a goal that didn't have anything to do with American interests whatsoever, then wouldn't it be possible for the United States to just completely ignore them and then have it to be counterintuitive to American interests further down the road that would be possibly unforeseen at the current time?
Yeah, I mean, is my mic on? No, yes? Yes. Okay. Yeah, sure. But there's lots of potential unforeseen consequences down the road of all sorts of policy options, and that isn't a justification for involvement everywhere in the world. Look, it's certainly possible the Maoists in Nepal could someday turn around and be a threat to the United States. I don't know how, but it's not inconceivable. Does that mean the United States ought to be sending troops to Nepal in order to stop the Maoist insurgency there? I think we need to be serious about what our national interests are and not invent threats that might occur or might not occur down the road. We need to sort of narrow down what our concerns are and address them firmly and decisively, but not invent bogeymen for us to drive our policy for years to come.
I would agree with that. But keep in mind, one of the reasons why 9/11 happened is because we have neglected this region for such a long time. And obviously we don't want that to happen again, but you are absolutely right. Counterterrorism as a policy should not be the main driver of U.S. foreign policy towards that region. You're absolutely right. It should be a subset of it. So far we've done a very poor job of actually incorporating counterterrorism into U.S. foreign policy. I would kindly urge you to read a very good book by Paul Pilar, which is titled Terrorism and U.S. Foreign Policy. He does a wonderful job actually explaining that fusion between the two.
Well, granted, we all know terrorism's bad. People get hurt, so it must be stopped, obviously. But in the grand scheme of things, how much does it really affect the world? In the grand scheme of things, does it really put everything on a stop? Can it ever really put everything to a stop? And also, to me, it just seems like a 3-year-old throwing in a temper tantrum, and once it breaks something, it'll calm down for like 3 minutes. And also, clearly, for someone to get to that point, to want to do something, they have to have the paradigm shaped to such that this place is evil, we got to destroy it, we got to hurt it. And how do you alter those paradigms of the radical Islams? How do you go about to change their perception of the United States?
You raise an excellent point. Listen, terrorism is a psychological weapon, and you're absolutely right. There are far more important and more urgent priorities this administration and the next administration are going to face as far as the Middle East is concerned. Nuclear proliferation, narcotics, absolutely failed states. I mean, these are really much more comprehensive issues we have to deal with, and terrorism is only one part of it. I would tend to argue with John Mueller, who has done a wonderful job making the case that terrorism, we tend to exaggerate it, and he gives you all these wonderful statistics about how someone dying while drowning in a bathtub basically has more statistics, better statistics than actually dying from a terrorist attack. You're absolutely right, but we're human beings, and this is our psychology is just. We're always going to find that terrorism problem so urgent and so demanding our utmost attention that I'm afraid it's not going to change anytime soon unless we all become perfectly rational human beings, which is absolutely that's not going to happen anytime soon, I guess.
I agree.
The policy prescription, I would probably leave Dr. Finel for that.
I don't have a particular policy prescription except to say that the notion that we have to go out and convince each and every Muslim in the world to like us is problematic. And look, I'll tell you, any of you ever go through a bad breakup with a boyfriend or girlfriend? I think we all have, right? Is the right answer to that to get in that person's grill and say, oh, take me back, or let me tell you why? No. There's sometimes when relationships are poisoned in such a way that it's not particularly productive to try to get really more intensely involved in it. And I think we may have reached a point where we're diminishing returns in terms of our interaction, public diplomacy-wise, in much of the Muslim world. Not that we can't do certain things differently, but the notion that all we're away from is a massive campaign of hearts and minds, that somehow is the answer, I think, is naive.
You began your statement, Mr. Saab, by saying it was it was perhaps possible to have a intelligent policy argument here in Orlando and not possible in Washington. And you may be right about that, but since we are in Orlando, let me ask you this. What question would you like to have, to both of you, our policymakers, or for those of us that are involved in any way in national security or on security on the state level, what question would you like to pose to those individuals that doesn't get asked, or what question would you like them to at least understand if they won't necessarily give you a fulsome answer on? What would you like them to understand that perhaps is missing from the debate today?
Invest in public diplomacy. This is the magical word. I don't think we've done a good job so far doing that. There's a number of people who are trying to basically make a greater effort in promoting that policy tool. But public diplomacy is such a wonderful tool in actually achieving all the goals that we've talked about today, which is to promote Muslim-U.S. understanding, trying to understand the region better, its peoples, its cultures, all those things. I think I guess that's my priority when I talk to a U.S. policymaker. It's just such an underdeveloped policy tool, and I understand the interagency problems with it. I don't think public diplomacy falls within the State Department or any office in the State Department because, quite frankly, for the past 7 years, the Pentagon has been the leading voice on public diplomacy, and it's led to disasters. So listen to the State Department and really try to again enhance the issue of public diplomacy as much as we can. And I don't know if you have better ideas.
Look, I mean, I'm skeptical about that, and I'll tell you why. We've been successful in some elements of our public diplomacy. If you look at the percentage of Muslims, for example, who support suicide bombing or terrorism, the numbers have plunged. If you look at the number of people who support bin Laden, they've declined significantly from sort of the 50s and 60% into the 20s and 30s in most countries. We've had some real successes. But look, you don't need 30, 40, 50% of the population support terrorism for it to be a problem for us. This isn't a mass movement fundamentally. It's a fringe element that's sustained in part by a culture created by a mass movement. There's a whole bunch of steps there that make the connections different. There's always going to be, in any civilization, in any society, a bunch of people, usually young men, who are disaffected for a variety of reasons, because they don't have economic prospects, they don't have a girlfriend, they don't have a chance for a wife, because they have mental illness, because they have dependency on drugs, a whole bunch of things. People who are willing to join cults, who are willing to join gangs. There's nothing you can do to dry up the swamp, because it doesn't take a swamp to create terrorism. It takes a puddle, and you can't dry up every single puddle in the world. And I think that's just the wrong approach, and I think that it's a wrong approach that leads you into very dangerous territory. And I'll give you an example. The Arab-Israeli dispute. Here I disagree with my colleague here. I don't know if you can solve it. It doesn't strike me that the wind sets for the two sides are yet overlapping sufficiently. There is, in fact, a solution to it. But irrespective of that, the problem is that the United States comes out and makes it seem as if it's a question of our involvement. If we get more involved, the solution will rise. If we're less involved, the solution will come. What that's telling people in the Muslim world is your fates depend upon us. All right? And the minute you tell people that your fates depend upon us, then when anything goes bad in the Muslim world, it's suddenly, well, look, it's the Americans' fault. They could be solving the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. They say so themselves. And they're not. Therefore, they have malicious implications. And that's why, even though we've had some success in public diplomacy, if you look at other kinds of things, we're tremendously unpopular in the Muslim world. There's a tremendous belief in conspiracy theories, including the belief in most Arab countries that the United States or Israel were behind 9/11 more so than Arabs. You have all sorts of pathological things going on, and I just don't see how you're going to talk people off the ledge on that. I think you need to create a breathing space that's going to allow the relationship to become less toxic over a period of time.
Whoops. Did you want to respond to that?
Just a very quick response. I don't think we disagree, Bernard. I'd like to differentiate between a spectacular terrorist attack and the mundane terrorist attacks that you see that cause casualties of a minor scale. The 9/11 attack demanded the work of not just two people sitting in a cave in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This required massive organizational capabilities that involved hundreds of people. And you're right, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort for me to, cause massive panic in the streets of New York or something like that. But how much damage can I create? That's the biggest problem. And I would disagree with you on the issue of the swamp of terrorism. You can have the ideology, it's always going to be there. It's always going to be an issue of how much you undermine it basically from within by Muslims themselves, right? But at the end of the day, there's going to be the implementer. There's going to be the foot soldier. And if you don't basically deny bin Laden his foot soldiers by engaging in a thorough, serious peace process, now I'm not going to talk about what specific role the United States government would have in promoting peace in the Middle East. You're right, absolutely. At the end of the day, the local actors themselves are going to have to figure this out because clearly the evidence, historical evidence suggests that we've done a very poor job promoting that. But I disagree with you. The peace process has a tremendous effect on the global war on terror for the reasons I just laid out.
Yes.
One of the things that interests me in what you're saying is that, and I agree with some of the backing off, but our inability to be energy independent is a curse. We messed up as a country in the 70s, but we're headed the right way, and they turned the oil back on, and now we're paying for our stupidity. And how do we not somehow keep involved, at least in the interim time, when we're moving hopefully towards energy independence?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that it's not an on-off switch, right? From my perspective, it's a matter of just, at each step in the process, sitting back and saying, what in fact are our national interests? Short run, long term, what's our strategy to get there? I mean, it's a real challenge here because in some cases, it's a resource issue. I mean, if we're talking about energy independence, that's fundamentally about tremendous involvement in the whole new power grid and building nuclear power plants and building wind power through the center of the country, the plain states. There's a huge amount of investment that needs to be done. And, man, I'll tell you, I look at the Iraq War, and to the extent that Iraq is seen as a central front of the war on terror, if you could give me the money, and not even talking about the lives, because the lives are irreplaceable, right? But if you give me the money that we spent in Iraq and you let me spend it on energy independence, I'd argue you'd probably get a bigger bang for the buck in terms of American security. That may just be me.
I don't think I have an intelligent answer, but I'm just going to address it tangentially. Your proposition implies that energy independence is good for its own terms. Absolutely, we have to do it. But your proposition implies indirectly that we no longer want to deal with the Middle East. And oil should not be the primary reason why we deal with the Middle East. And that's why we want to be independent. Because, right, and we're getting all sorts of problems from the Middle East and troubles and 9/11 and all that. I think it's, there are other issues why the United States is involved in the region. I don't want to name the obvious, for strategic reasons. And Israel. Israel is a big issue. As I often, talk to Israelis and Americans, that bilateral relationship absolutely informs, in a great way, U.S. involvement in the region. So energy independence, yes, absolutely. Does that mean we can forget about the Middle East after that? I don't think so.
I think they're signaling me that we're out of time, so we're going to end this panel, and thank you very much for your presentations.